I'll declare this briefing session open at 6 p.m. Welcome to those in the gallery and watching online. The City of Vincent would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We'll move on to our apologies. I think it's probably fairly obvious that Mayor Emma Cole is an apology this evening. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Susan Gonchevsky. I'm the Deputy Mayor here at the City of Vincent. CEO, do we have any other apologies this evening?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, no we don't. Just Mayor Cole for illness.
Okay, well I think we'll just get started. We'll now move on to public question time and the receiving of public statements. The City does live stream its briefing sessions, but we do turn off the streaming of for this section of the agenda. We respect your privacy at this time and we'll resume the stream at the conclusion of public question time. So this is an opportunity for you to come up and speak or ask questions on any of the items on tonight's agenda. Questions or statements that don't relate to the specific items on the agenda may be raised at next week's council meeting. When you come up to the microphone, we ask that you state your name, address and the item you're addressing this evening. Everyone gets 3 minutes. There's a timer, so if you do hear the alarm, it's time to wrap up your statement. And we do ask that everyone's respectful and considerate of the views of others. So may I have the first speaker, please? We'll now move on to declarations of interest. CEO, have we received any this evening?
No, I've not received any, Deputy Mayor.
Okay, so we'll now move through the agenda, beginning with the development services items. Item 5.1, Unit 7, 117 Brisbane Street, Perth, proposed amendment to the condition on the previous approval, change of use from office to unlisted use. Do we have any questions on that one? No? Well, somewhat typically I had a question. Director of Development Services, I just wanted to check on this one in relation to the bicycle bay that was previously conditioned as to whether that's actually been installed.
Yes, through you, Madam Presiding Member, I think it's probably the best. I will have to take that on notice. I understand that bike parking has been installed, but I need to confirm whether the applicant installed that or whether the City installed that. So I'll take that on notice and provide that in the briefing notes.
Thank you. Okay, item 5.2, London Street, North Perth, proposed unlisted use home business chiropractor. Me again. Director of Development Services, I just had 2 questions on this. One related to the chiropractic qualifications being cited, and 2 was in relation to the determination advice notes and the relationship to the conditions. Specifically that there's a point of difference with the number of clients and customers that may be present and the number of outside staff that may be employed. I just wondered if that's correct or if I perhaps misread that or if that's material in any way.
Sorry, through you, which, are you talking about the number of staff in the advice note? Is there a difference between the advice note and the condition?
So the advice note says that it does not employ more than 2 people, not members of the occupier's household. The condition talks about not more than 1 chiropractor working there at any one time. The let me go back here. And so that's the 3 therapists. Let me have a look. No, I'm on the wrong one.
Yes, through you, the reason for that difference is because the definition of home business
Yeah.
has been quoted in the advice note. It certainly would be worthwhile clarifying that the conditions supersede that definition. When that was put together, I did think about that, I recall. And there isn't an inconsistency as such because they need to comply with both requirements. However, it would certainly be worthwhile clarifying that. In relation to the qualifications, I'll have to take that on notice to confirm that the qualifications were provided with the application. They should have been, but I'll confirm that in the briefing notes.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're on to number 5.3, Charles Street, North Perth, change of use from shop to unlisted use, non-medical consulting rooms. Councillor Hallett.
Through the presiding member to the Director of Development Services. Just a couple of questions. When the use classification was initially approved, was it unclear in the application as to which consulting room use it aligned with, and was it confusion on the part of the applicant applying for the wrong one?
Yes, through the presiding member. I understand that there was probably confusion both by the city's officers at the time and with the applicant. The applicant put their application in for a massage premises, essentially, and it was classified as that use. So I don't think there was anything deliberate on behalf of the applicant. I think it was an error on behalf of the city and the applicant not being aware of what the requirements were.
And could you just also confirm the difference between the Class 1 and Class 2 bicycle bays and how that distinction's applied to a development? But feel free to direct me to a specific document if that's easier.
Yes, through the presiding member. The difference is that I think it's the Class 1 bays are required to include the Class 3 bays are required to have end-of-trip facilities, essentially, or lockable and lockable areas, an area to store equipment and the bike itself, while the Class 1 and 2 facilities are simply an area for the bike to be locked to. So the Class 3 facilities are more significant than the Class 1 and 2 facilities, if you understand. And all of that's available. We can provide that in the briefing notes to explain the details of each, but they're all set out in the Australian standards.
Any further questions? Councillor Topple, please.
Thank you. The comments, or the informal car parking that's noted on the plans at the rear, and then the proposed car bays which are to be conditioned and provided there, are they supposed to be exclusively for this side of the development, or also potentially for the neighbouring development, which is the Pilates studio? Because that's not clear.
Yes, through the presiding member, the parking will just be for this premises. It'll only be for the portion of the site, I think it's the northern portion of the site, that they have control over. So it doesn't apply to the Pilates studio to the south. So it'll just be the northern side of the car park, or that rear area, which is being informally used as the car park. Now, we've done an assessment, and that can be achieved simply through tandem parking and a management plan.
Anything further? No? Any further questions on this one? Okay, I had one as well. I note that the cash in lieu fees were waived when the application was approved as a consulting room under delegated authority. I just wanted to find out what the value was and the mechanism, whether they were sort of put on hold or whether they were whether it was actually permanently written off, the fees to this value, and whether any communication was had with the applicant at this time regarding the possibility of this waiving not necessarily being continued past the 12 months of the original approval.
Yes, through the original approval waived that parking requirement on the basis that it complied with the policy provisions at the time, and it was considered that in the case of this change of use, it wasn't appropriate that the cash in lieu be paid. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't something that was waived temporarily necessarily, and it's been recommended that that condition not be applied, the cash in lieu not be applied, because there seems to be there doesn't seem to be any connection between the 12-month approval and the cash in lieu being waived. It seemed to be waived independent of that time-limited approval or that time limit condition. However, the council are open to the option of applying the cash in lieu. I think the risk is that one of the principles of orderly and proper planning is consistent decision making, and so on that basis we haven't considered it appropriate in this instance. However, it's not clear, and so council is open to consider applying the cash in lieu if they consider it's necessary.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Toppleburg.
So just a further question. Can we get some details around the traffic or the parking volumes? So I think is it War Street, which is immediately adjacent to there? I think was so at some stage, I think following the development on the Chicken Treat site, which is the 4-storey office building effectively opposite, so adjacent to the liquor land. In the time after that building was completed, we received a number of complaints about lack of parking in the area and introduced parking restrictions in the street immediately adjacent. It would be good to have that information. I'll talk more next week about the waiving of cash in lieu under delegated authority, but my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's zoned local centre, and there is car parking restrictions in all the immediately surrounding streets other than the car park to the rear.
So we can take that on notice and provide some information around the car parking usage in the area that we have information on. I think we have a lot of information just in the general vicinity.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 5.4, Newcastle Street, West Perth, an amendment to a previous approval, renewal of billboard signs approval. Do we have any questions? Councillor Hallett.
I understand that the lot owner is unable to develop the site currently, mostly due to the proximity to a major intersection and the barriers to accessing the site. In the report, admin refers to a requirement for the developer to provide road upgrades to enable access. What would that actually look like?
Through the presiding member, there's a number of options for redevelopment of the site. In order to have access to one of the major roads as part of this development from this site itself, there would need to be slip lanes and some pretty major changes to the road and the intersection itself in order to accommodate a safe entry and exit from the site. The other options relate to amalgamation with other sites, as well as the potential of access being waived, or requirement for access being waived in the longer term, depending on the development outcome. So it may be that no parking is required ultimately for the site because there's another arrangement with an adjoining owner or some other arrangement that wouldn't warrant access to the site directly, and there could be an easement or something else provided through another site or some other arrangement to allow for the necessary access.
Would you expect there to be much significant development in the nearby sites such as Watercorp in less than 10 years?
Through the presiding member, I do consider that there would be significant redevelopment, or there will be considerable redevelopment in the immediate vicinity of this site, given the heights that have been applied through the built form policy have increased the development potential for these sites, and given the new scheme is about to be introduced as well over the site, which it does retain the existing zoning but does create some certainty for developers in this location. And given the proximity to the CBD, I do think that there is, in the next 10 years, the potential for development to occur. So that was the rationale for the 10-year condition, along with discussions with the applicant around what they considered to be reasonable, given the history of the rolling 5-year approvals.
And just under the existing conditions, the advertising content displayed on the billboard signs shall not contain material that, by reasonable definition as determined by the city, may be offensive to the public or cause unacceptable levels of distraction. Could the Director provide any examples of what material may contravene that condition?
Through the presiding member, I can take that on notice. It may well be presented in the report that was provided to Council when the application was considered last in 2014, but if not, we'll have a look at the advertising standards and provide with some information around that.
Thank you, Director. Anything further, Councillor Hallett? Councillor Topelberg?
Thank you. Just in relation to the I mean, obviously there's a benefit to the owner of, or there's the ability for the owner to earn income from the site without developing it, clearly. Are we entirely reliant, if you talk about the option, and I don't think forcing other landowners to get involved is an option that's open to the city, obviously. Are we entirely reliant on the owner for the access to the site making it undevelopable, or are we able to make those changes such that the site could either be rezoned or be excluded from the policy provisions by decision of council, with or without the owner's consent, such that the site could be developable? Because the reason I ask is that obviously there is, it's debatable what interest there is for the owner to pursue other options if they are able to derive an income without doing anything other than having some grass and some billboards. So what options are available to the city in order to encourage or make the site developable without involving landowners over whom we have no control?
Through the presiding member, there are options available through policy and through the scheme that the city could pursue to help facilitate the appropriate development outcome in this context. At the moment, the driver for that change is the time-limited approval, because there's no certainty for the owner past this current 5-year approval or any subsequent extension to that time frame that they'll gain another approval. And so there is, we're certainly encouraging them to look at redeveloping the site to deliver the outcome that the city has set out in its scheme and its local planning strategy in the built form policy. So at the moment, that's the mechanism that's been being followed. But there is the option for other policy mechanisms mechanisms through the scheme to be investigated, and there's a whole range of options in that space.
And just last question. So there was a change in site manager over the last approval period. It was under management. It's now with the owner, is my understanding. And some of it, whilst the landscaping conditions remained, the visual amenity of the landscaping is different. Some people may prefer it the way it was or the way it is. That's individual, up to the individual. But just in relation to the 1.2 metre high colour bond, which sits underneath both of the billboards, the hedges that are in front of them are considerably lower than what the hedging was previously, and that has a visual impact on the site. Are we satisfied that the current state of the landscaping meets the condition, or are we waiting for those hedges to grow, or are we blessed with colour bond for eternity?
Through the presiding member, I'll need to take that on notice. I certainly haven't looked specifically at the height of the hedges and whether that was required by the previous approval. It doesn't seem to be, having a look at the attachment to the previous decision. But nevertheless, I'll take that on notice and check. And the current advice I have is that that landscaping plan is being complied with. But I'll just check in any case and provide that in the briefing notes.
Thank you, Director. Councillor Vitagas.
Thank you. Through you, Presiding Officer, through to our Developer of Planning. John, should the owner of the land want to actually change the nature of the billboards, such as introducing digital boards, what's the process? Does that need to actually come back to Council for approval?
Sorry, through the presiding member, I didn't catch that last bit. What change were you...
Well, they're currently standard static boards, so in the future if the owner wanted to change those or the tenant wanted to change those to digital, and obviously it's just following on from the point that Councillor Hallett raised with regards to visual issues, what would be the process moving forward?
Yes, through the presiding member, the existing condition on the approval states that the billboard signs shall not have flashing or intermittent lighting as determined by the city. I will need to take on notice whether they could have an electronic sign that doesn't flash or change colour. Obviously, it'll need to change occasionally when the sign changes. So I'll take that on notice just to understand whether that would be a breach of the condition or not. If it was a breach of the condition, then it would be an application. They would need to lodge an application to amend that condition, which would come to council for consideration. If they could have an electronic billboard, which it seems to me would be permitted if it was just a static electronic image, then it wouldn't be able to flash. They wouldn't be able to have advertising that would distract cars and those kinds of things, given that condition 2.1. But if they wanted to do that, they would need to seek approval through council.
Anything further? Councillor Murphy?
Thanks. Through the chair, maybe to corporate services, I'm interested if there is any financial contribution given to the city for the billboards beyond standard rates. Is there any charge that we're placing on? Additional charge?
Through the presiding member, there will certainly be a charge, a rates charge to the property. There's no additional charges as a result of it being a billboard sign specifically, though. It's treated like every other property in the city, and it's rated on its value.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, sorry, I think what Councillor Murphy might be getting at is whether or not there's a vacant commercial versus a commercial rate applied to the property. We can find that out and let council members know through the briefing notes.
And just in the future, if we were to produce a public signage policy that charged for public or private advertising in the next 10 years, would this prevent us placing a fee or levy on this sign if we approve it for the next 10 years?
Director or CEO?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I can answer that. The short answer is that if the charge that you're referring to is a fee under the planning fees and charges regulations, then the fee that council can charge for this type of development is dictated by those regulations. If it's to be some other fee or charge imposed, such as through a differential rate for this type of property or this type of use, then that is something that we'd have to look at in more detail. The application fee is a one-off, so once it's paid for this particular application and a decision is made, then that application fee is the one and only fee that would need to be charged or paid for the duration of this approval remaining valid, because you effectively buy that approval for that fee. If it's a rate charge, then the charge determined by council year on year through its annual budget process is what will apply to the property. So hopefully that provides some clarity.
Councillor Toppelberg?
Sorry, just one further landscaping question. I do note that on the currently approved landscaping plan there's a tree which is shown to be in the north-eastern corner of the site. My understanding is that when the property to the north at the end of Kingston Avenue was cleared, that they cleared this tree even though it wasn't on their land, and so that doesn't actually exist. And if a quick look at Google Maps shows that some of those hedges are different to what was shown on there, but that tree, through no fault of the owner, but just to note that the landscaping shown on the currently approved plan is not able to be the same today.
Director, do you have any comment?
My only comment would be that through the presiding member, the existing tree, it was noted as an existing tree. If it's been removed, then at no fault of the owners, then at no fault of their own, this landscaping plan is now different to what is on site.
Any further questions on this item? No, we'll move on to item 5.5, Walcott Street, North Perth, proposed amendment to condition of approval, change of use consulting rooms. Any questions? Councillor Hallett.
Through the presiding member to Director of Development Services, is there a reason that bicycle parking facilities aren't included in this, or have I just missed it?
Through the presiding member, I assume that as the parking and access planning element is ticked as deemed to comply, that the bike parking is compliant. However, I will check and provide that in the briefing notes as well.
Thank you, Director. Anything further? No? Okay, we'll move on to item 5.6, Chelmsford Road, Mount Lawley, change of use from 2 group dwellings to single house and eating house with alterations and additions. Councillor Hallett.
Sorry, I've got a few. The applicant provided councillors with a number of examples of commercial entities situated adjunct to residential areas within the City of Vincent by email today. Could you comment on how this application might differ from those?
Yes, through the presiding member. I think there were 4 existing establishments that were provided in that email. 2 of them are zoned commercial or local centre. From memory, I think it was Sliding Door on Mary Street, and I can't remember the name of the other one. Both of those properties are zoned commercial, so that's very different to the residential zoning of this site. The other 2 examples were historically corner stores and delis in residential areas that had been had a change of use application from a shop to an eating house. And again, so that's a different example to this situation where the existing use is a residential use. It's a single house at the moment, and it's changing to a commercial use. So neither of those, or none of those examples are similar to this situation, which is a residential property in a residential zone being proposed to change to a commercial use.
Was there a reason why the applicant didn't provide a detailed landscaping plan? And was there any rationale provided as to why no bicycle parking bays are included?
I'd have to take those on notice and provide that in the briefing notes.
In attachment 2, the consultant acting for the applicant states that they've confirmed that no parking will be provided on site and that cash in lieu will be applied. My understanding is that cash in lieu is not default alternative condition when parking is not provided, and it's at the discretion of council. Can you clarify that?
Yes, through the presiding member, that's correct. It's at the discretion of council whether the cash in lieu is a reasonable response to the shortfall in the parking provided on site.
There was an additional comment referring to, also in the public gallery, the development adding lighting and activation to the adjacent right-of-way. This might be to the Director of Engineering. Are there currently any planned works for that right-of-way, and have there been concerns raised about its current state?
Through you, presiding member, the simple answer is I'll have to take that on notice and put it in the information for the week, for Friday.
Last one. The consultant also states that there was no plan to compromise on the layout of the site after submitting the plans to the city. Is that a common position that applicants take when preparing development applications?
Through the presiding member, applicants often respond to concerns raised during community consultation by changing their plans to address those concerns. So that does occur regularly, but I think that's a positive thing where applicants respond to concerns through that process.
Anything further, Councillor Hannett? Any further questions? Just in relation to the comment from Rocco in the public gallery, in relation to the report referencing I think it was landscaping, bifolds and the number of tables or patrons in the alfresco area, that there's a difference between the current plans. Can I get some comment on that, please?
There certainly is, through the presiding member, a difference between the number of tables. It is certainly 2, not 3, so I apologise for that and we'll fix that in the report. The bifold doors is a similar error in the report. It shouldn't refer to those, and we'll clarify that. In relation to the right-of-way width, I'll need to confirm the width to ensure that that's correct in the report, and I'll provide that in the briefing notes along with the landscaping references in the report, just to clarify that they're not out of context.
And can I just confirm that this is a difference in the report compared to the plans, that what was actually consulted on with the surrounding impacted residents was based on the current, what's currently in the plans in the report?
Through the presiding member, that's my understanding, that the application was advertised twice. But again, I'll need to confirm that and provide that in the briefing notes as well, just to confirm that the plans are exactly the same as what was advertised last time. There may have been some minor changes, I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. No further questions on this item? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 5.7 has been withdrawn. And 5.8, move on to the outcomes of advertising policy number 7.71, non-residential development parking requirements. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. So just in response to a couple of things that were raised from the gallery, the comment in relation to the car parking table for in relation to office users, just to make sure that I have it correct, because it was incorrectly stated from the gallery. But we currently have one space per required per 50 square metres of space, and whilst that is lessening in town centre zonings, it is actually increasing, either remaining the same or increasing for other zonings. Is that correct? Am I reading that correctly?
Through the presiding member, that's my understanding. I want to confirm that and provide that in the briefing notes as well, though.
Cool. And clause 4.1, Mr. Meyer was correct, there wasn't justification provided for deleting it, but essentially that was the clause which required cash in lieu not being seen as a cheap way of providing excess car bays for residential use, where obviously, particularly when apartments are being sold or on-sold, it's a relatively cheap decision for a developer. Can we get some clarity as to why that was deleted? If not, I'll seek to amend to include either that clause or something that's better written to be included.
I'll also, through the presiding member, add that to the briefing notes to explain the rationale, the full rationale behind it. But yes, that was my understanding as well.
Anything further, Councillor Toppelberg?
Not at this stage, no, thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Hallett?
Can I just clarify, under the section on end-of-trip facilities, that 5.3.2 would not prevent a development from having up to 10 individual unisex facilities, as implied by 5.3.1?
Through the presiding member, just bear with me while I review those two provisions. So it was 5.3.1, which I can't seem to find. I see a 5.2, but no 5.3. Which clause were you referring to? So through the presiding member, the number of end-of-trip facilities is basically the requirement is one for every 5 long-term parking bays required. So there's no limit to the number. It's as many as there are parking bays, basically.
Okay. Yes, Councillor Hallett.
Just in light of, I guess, partly raised in the public gallery, but in light of recent discussions on autonomous vehicles and declining private car ownership, what avenues will be available to Council to revise the requirements around future-proofing of car parking facilities under buildings in terms of their heights, air circulation, etc., for retrofitting them into alternative uses? And is that something that could be part of this policy in the future, or is it integrated just into the built form, or both?
Through the presiding member, I think that it's probably best placed in the built form policy, given all of the built form requirements are set out in that policy. However, it certainly would be open to Council to consider it as part of both policies in the future once we have a very clear picture around how to address that issue most appropriately.
Anything further, Councillor Hallett? No. Councillor Toppelberg?
Sorry, I did forget one question. Why did we remove the requirement for doubling of cash in lieu for new developments?
Through the
that were DAP-sized developments, so larger developments.
Through the presiding member, that's touched on in the report. The rationale was that there is no difference between the cost of the city providing a parking bay from a non-DAP development versus the cost of the city providing a parking bay for a DAP development. And on that basis, it was considered appropriate for the cash in lieu number to be the same, irrelevant of what type of development it was. The other factor that was considered was the city's current review of the cash in lieu for car parking process and the fees that are charged, or the cash in lieu price that is set by the city. And as part of that process, it's proposed that a review of that number will be undertaken, and a change, if necessary, will be recommended to Council through the budget process following that cash in lieu review.
I think that that's understood, and I guess I'm trying not to debate it, so I'll be careful in my comments. But what do you think of the alternative rationale? There you go. The clause may have existed to discourage people from seeking approval for the lowest car parking requirement, understanding that there would, for example, office use, understanding that their intent was to place an eating house or restaurant or otherwise in the premises, and they may in fact apply for a change of use before even building or constructing the development. And those were some of the reasons that, from memory, the clause was put in there, because those were real examples of what we saw. Are we comfortable that that sort of rationale is no longer out there in the big wide developer world?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Toppelberg. Director?
Through the presiding member, I agree that there certainly are issues with new developments proposing a lower intensity use that results in a lower car parking requirement that's followed up with changes of use that require more parking in an existing building that can't accommodate any more parking. So that's certainly been an issue. I'm not sure how requiring twice the cash in lieu for those larger scale developments will result in discouraging that. As was mentioned earlier, it's completely at Council's discretion whether or not to approve a shortfall in parking, whether the applicant wants to pay cash in lieu or not. If the amount of car parking that is available or being proposed as part of a change of use is not considered to be appropriate, then Council is well within its rights, and in fact should refuse the application if the cash in lieu is not going to provide an alternative that will address the shortfall. So that's the principle under which this policy has been drafted, and I think doubling the cash in lieu having that provision needs to be equitable in the context of all development applications, because the cost of providing the cash in lieu is the same, irrelevant of the scale of the development.
Thank you, Director. Anything further? Councillor Harley?
Through you, Chair. Just through to the Director of Planning, just wanting to understand a bit more about the end-of-trip facilities and some specific examples, which maybe my question is about whether there are additional imposts on small business And if I can provide an example as part of that question, so in this, a small bar, they're required to provide 1 bay per 20 patrons, and then they're required to provide end-of-trip facilities as a ratio to how many car bays. Have I understood that correctly? So a small bar with 80 patrons provides a minimum of, or 100 patrons, for example, minimum of 5 bays, and they have to provide end-of-trip facilities. Is that right?
Through the presiding member, the revised policy specifically includes a long-term bicycle parking standard for each use. So it's not based on the number of car bays anymore. It's based on a specific ratio that applies in Table 1. Now, what's been changed in the policy, how the policy works, is that with long-term and short-term bicycle parking, if an applicant has a development, so for instance, I think we're talking about a small bar, the ratio is 0.042 long-term parking spaces per person accommodated. So let's say there's 10 persons proposed, that'll equal 0.42 bicycle parking bays required. And the way the policy works is that it's rounded to the nearest whole number. So in that case, at 0.42 bicycle parking bays, it would become 0. They wouldn't have to provide any, and therefore they wouldn't have to provide any long end-of-trip facilities. That's different to the car parking requirements, because if the car parking requirement was 0.42, it would be rounded up to the nearest whole number, which is the approach we've taken consistently at Vincent throughout the history of the city. So that's how we've tried to address that issue. If, I don't know, there's 15 bays required, 20 bays required, then they will be required to provide a long-term bicycle parking bay and an end-of-trip facility for that long-term bicycle parking bay. And the basis for that is that every time a long-term bicycle parking facility is provided, that's for a staff member essentially, that's what that's set up for, and that's so the staff member can ride and have the comfort of knowing that when they arrive at work, they'll be able to have a shower, get changed and start work, as opposed to requiring a long-term bicycle parking facility but no end-of-trip facility to go with that, which kind of discourages the reason for the bike parking being provided in the first place. Now, there are a couple of options there for applicants. So instead of providing that bike parking facility, they can agree with other landowners or with the city to share end-of-trip facility. So there is that option, and council also has the discretion to waive the requirement for the bike parking and for the end-of-trip facility where it's considered appropriate because of the context of the development. So there's enough parking or other facilities in the area that would warrant that requirement being waived. Sorry, that's a long-winded explanation, but hopefully that makes sense.
Through you, Chair, thank you. So my question is about whether any of this is placing any additional imposts on small businesses in a place such as Vincent, where we've got a lot of existing buildings we're trying to activate. Space is of the essence and often non-existent in very small rentals. One of the reasons why I'm asking is I saw a recent example where I thought it was very ingenious in terms of how they had how we had allowed them compliantly to allow a bathroom, etc. So my question is about whether any of this is placing any more impost on small business owners where space is lacking, and are we creating any more impost on them? We're requiring a male, we're requiring a female. And sorry, by way of example, I'm aware of many buildings in the city where they have mixed, where it's unisex. They're separated, but they're no longer broken up into male and female, and that's not a political statement. It's just the way things are going in a lot of the buildings now where they do not break these facilities up. Is the administration looking at this to ensure that we're not creating more red tape for small businesses at a time when we are trying to activate and have adaptive reuse of our existing buildings?
Director, do you have any comment in relation to the impost on?
Yes, I'll need to confirm what the numbers were under the previous policy for end of trip facilities compared to this proposal to comment on whether it's an additional impost or not. One of the major changes that we made was the definition of end of trip facility is now a unisex facility, so it's not one male and one female, it's a unisex facility and one locker, to specifically address the fact that there's one bicycle parking bay required. So we have tried to address those issues. I too have seen some ingenious responses to this requirement as part of applications that have come before council before. I can think of one on Beaufort Street in Mount Lawley, which converted an existing bathroom into an end of trip facility, so a locker and a shower. They met their bathroom requirement that was set out under the building code, as well as the end of trip facility requirement in one. So it wasn't an additional burden for them at all, because they had to provide that bathroom anyway for their patrons as part of the development and a part of the BCA requirements. So that's certainly how we've structured it. Whether the amount of end of trip facilities has increased, I'll need to clarify that and provide that in the briefing notes.
Anything further? Okay, I had one on this, which I will just find my notes. So in the final version of the policy, I think that objectives 1 and 2 require minor amendment, 1 to remove an extra word 2, and then also perhaps objective 2 needs the word facilitate to be reinserted, or make provision for, or something, another term to be inserted to make sure that particular objective flows appropriately. But that was my picky wordsmithing. The other question that I had was, where a development doesn't meet the requirements of Table 1 and the applicant has made a submission against the objectives of the policy and the requirements set out in section 1.2. The policy refers to the decision maker as considering that application against the objectives in section 1.2. I just wanted to check in relation to this policy where the authority for decision making lies, and whether there is the intention to review that as it's rolled out.
Through the presiding member, the decision maker is included in this policy not for any other reason other than the decision maker could be a variety of decision makers. Could be the DAP, it could be the city under delegated authority, or it could be the council. Council's position on who should make those decisions is rightly set out in the delegations. So I know we'll be shortly reviewing the delegations as a result of the new scheme, its imminent application, and that's certainly something that can be discussed with council at that time. Hopefully I've got the question right.
You have got the question right. I guess I just was, if you could refresh my memory what the delegations are in relation to this policy currently, and also in terms of the timing, in terms of if this policy was to be approved, when it would take effect, and then the likely lag time between its delegations being reviewed.
Through the presiding member, currently there is no restriction in the delegations on administration's ability to vary the requirement of the parking policy for any application it has delegation to determine. So there's a whole number of conditions set out under the delegations, including the number of objections received for particular types of applications, limits on height. So I think it's any application 3 stories or above is required to be presented to council, and there's a whole list of things. But none of those conditions refer to compliance with this policy, and so, or the current policy. And so currently a cash in lieu requirement could be waived, or a parking shortfall could be approved under delegated authority theoretically. In relation to the timing of this policy, if it is adopted by Council next week, it would then need to be advertised in a newspaper. A notice would need to be published before it would become operational, and that would typically take 2 to 4 weeks. The timing of the scheme is, I'm less certain about that, and we have less control over that. The Minister, I understand the Minister currently has the scheme, the final version of the scheme to sign, so that could happen any day, and from there the scheme would need to be published in the Government Gazette, and the time frame for that is quite similar to the time frame for advertising a policy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no further questions on this one. We will move on to engineering, to 6.1, Charles Verriard Reserve Community Survey results regarding the dog exercise area. Councillor Loden.
Just 2 questions. The first one was the one raised by from the gallery around the clarity we provided within the engagement with the community, and if they had any, if you wanted to provide a response to that question.
CEO, you might want to answer this one.
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Sorry, not cutting off the Director only because some of the background predates Andrew's appointment. A couple of comments I'd just raise is that there was a explanatory covering sheet included with the survey as well as the online version that did identify the point that the member of the public raised during the question. I've just got an extract of it here. I'll just read it out for you. And it identified that the city's gone back to the drawing board. Instead of asking for your views on specific designs and dimensions for a fenced dog exercise area, we'd like to now find out what you think about the idea in the first instance. With your feedback, we'll then be able to better understand whether there is a community need or desire for an enclosed dog exercise area at the reserve. If there is, then we can get to work designing it, including its size, location, shape, and the type of fencing, landscaping equipment that could be installed. Because as the gentleman rightly highlighted in the gallery, when the consultation was first undertaken on the dog exercise area some time ago, council members might recall that what was presented to the community was viewed by some members of the community as a bit of a predetermined position to say, well, this is all you're getting, here's where it's going, here's what it's going to look like. And there was a lot of feedback received, not about the general intent and purpose and whether there was an appetite for that in the community, but in relation to the specific design and dimension of that. In the case of this particular survey, we deliberately did want to keep it general, to just ask the community what their views were on a specific and enclosed, either partially or fully, dog exercise area at the reserve. The covering page to the survey also did identify some key facts that the whole of the reserve is actually a designated off-lead dog exercise area, except when organised sport is being played. Because it's related to the same, and with your indulgence, Madam Presiding Member, I'd also just add some clarification around the statistics of the cohort that were in the maybe, which I'd probably just draw council members' attention to page 193 of the agenda papers, because that's probably the best place to start. Question 3 was where the question was asked, would you be supportive of a fully enclosed dog exercise area at the reserve? And you'll note from there that there were 29 maybes identified, constituting 19% only of the overall respondents. So then if you flip over the page and you look at the responses to question 4, you'll see that whilst only 29 people responded maybe to question 3, there's actually 51 total responses to question 4. There's a couple of reasons for that. It may well be that I'll have to go back and check in terms of the survey design if you could only complete question 4 if you answered maybe to question 3. Or alternatively, it may be that the way that the data was gathered through the survey form, it allowed a single respondent to select all 3 or any one or more of those reasons for answering maybe. Even if you take either view, on the 29 maybes that responded to question 3, that equates, and if you apply the 43% relating to the location within the reserve from question 4, that equates to about 13 people responding to maybe on the basis of that particular location issue, which represents only 8.6% of all respondents. Alternatively, if you flick over the page to question 4, the 22 respondents represents 43%, or less than half of the 51 responses that were received overall for the maybes in that particular question, which represents those 22 out of 151 responses is only 14.5%. So, in my view, they are not determinative numbers upon which to interpret the survey results anyway other than what they've been interpreted. I hope that provides some clarity.
Councillor Loden, anything further?
Thank you. My other question was around the proposal is for to increase the area of green space or landscaping. And I just want to clarify around if the density of that landscaping, what the density of that landscaping would be. Is it going to be easily permeable for a dog to get through, or is that part of the proposal?
Through you, Presiding Member, not easily permeable, but obviously a dog, it will be permeable.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, and apologies if I've missed it, but are the pine posts going that are on Cal Street, or will they remain and just we'll plant around them?
Director.
In order to currently to prevent vehicles driving on, that we've got I don't know what the correct, they're pine posts. They sit about that high, but they're currently around the reserve. My assumption is that they are staying, but just it's not clear.
Through you, Presiding Member, rather than give an answer that's incorrect, I'll check that and take the question on notice.
Thank you, Director. Councillor Castle.
Just one quick question, going back to question 4 of the survey, as the CEO outlined. Did we gather any information from the people who chose other in that particular question? Did they have the opportunity to write something in?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes. My recollection in terms of the survey design was that there was a fillable field included where residents could include that, and I have seen, so I know that we've got the results, and I'd be happy to add it to attachment 1 to this report for public interest. That does identify the whole range of responses that were provided in a general sense as to the other category, so we can include that.
But from your recollection, perhaps there wasn't anything, any great idea that was common to a lot of those other respondents. Otherwise, I assume we might have been discussing that option.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, the only truthful answer I could provide is I'm presuming that because it's not referenced, that is the case, but we'll find that out.
Anything further? Just in relation to the comment from the gallery around the existing use, and I believe there was a request for the recommendation to be amended to perhaps affirm or note that the existing use of Charles Verriard Reserve as a off-leash dog exercise area is remaining unchanged as a result of this further decision. And just for the member of the gallery, just to confirm that that is correct.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes, that's certainly correct, and that would remain the case until or unless otherwise determined by Council. That is something that we had intended to include in the communication that goes back to all survey respondents as a result of this Council decision, but equally, if Council feels more comfortable to just restate that fact, then we'd be happy to build it into the officer recommendation. That's not a concern.
Yeah, well, I'll flag that we perhaps could craft some words to that effect for next week. Moving on to the next item, which I will get to my contents. Item 6.2, with a tender for the supply and delivery of the one-side loading automatic bin lifter refuse truck. Any questions? I'm looking at you, Councillor Loden. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. My question is just to clarify around the comparative weighting between the CapEx component, which is set at 35%, and the life cycle costs plus warranty, which is set at 20%, because rubbish trucks are very fuel intensive. They use about 83 litres per 100 kilometres. So a truck doing 200 kilometres a day will chew about 90 grand of fuel, 90 grand of fuel a year, which over its operating life adds up to over $500,000, which when you compare that number to the capital cost of this, which is in the confidential part of the briefing, those weightings seem out of sync.
Through you to the Director, any comment?
Okay, so if I explain how we've dealt with cost, if I may, through you, Presiding Member, when we refer to price, that is purely the tender price, so that is the cost of the vehicle. It doesn't include life cycle costs, etc. When we've looked at life cycle costs, that particular criteria, we've looked at the cost of maintaining the vehicle for, I believe it was 6 years, which is the estimated time we'll keep it. For the purposes of comparison, we've assumed that both vehicles will use the same fuel amount because there are a number of variables there that are difficult to calculate. You're right, they do use a lot of fuel, but they are very similar vehicles, both in size and weight and engine capacity, so we've made the assumption for comparison that they will use the same amount of fuel.
Councillor Loden.
Was any consideration given to more fuel-efficient rubbish trucks?
Thank you. Through you, Presiding Member. The tender that was put out was for a Euro 6 or Euro 5 diesel vehicle. So those are the most efficient diesel vehicles available on the market. We didn't allow for alternative vehicles like electric or whatever. That's purely because they're not widely available on the market, although that is an emerging market, and we expect in the future there may be some opportunities in that area. For the purposes of this tender, we asked for a standard rubbish truck, diesel vehicle, and you can see that both tenders were compliant and came back with a Euro 6, which is the best available diesel vehicle at the moment.
Councillor Loden.
And then under a potentially new purchasing policy, it refers to highest efficiency vehicles. Would that be a consideration for future as well?
To you, Simon Member, absolutely there are some significant opportunities for the city to reduce emissions and improve fuel efficiency, which will also decrease cost. So we'll, in the future, next year, we'll be certainly looking at a different style of procurement. This particular year, this is the last vehicle to be procured, so we are keen to procure this vehicle to maintain service levels, but the future, particularly with emerging technologies, will be different, and we'll be looking at those opportunities.
Anything further, Councillor Loden? Any other questions in relation to this item? No? Okay. We'll move on to item 6.3, which is the response to the notice of motion, higher order waste management. Councillor Hallett.
I'm not sure which. Well, I guess it would be too. Director of Engineering. Under the section on improvements in the last 12 months, there's a reference to the city supporting the Responsible Cafes program. Just wondering what that support looks like.
It's quite simple support. Through you, Presiding Member, we support as an international scheme, and if cafes offer discounts, if you bring your own cup, which a lot of cafes in City of Vincent do, they get some form of certification with our logo on, and if you look around some of the cafes, you'll see that particular certificate with our logo on.
Councillor Hallett.
So I guess what's the role of our support? Is it assistance with printing or financial or logistics?
Through you, Presiding Member, budgetary very small. We just provide the certificate.
Councillor Loden.
Just wanted to clarify the information talks about collaboration with neighbouring councils and refers to City of Perth and Stirling, which are part of the MRC. And I was wondering if we do collaborate with any neighbouring councils that are not within the MRC but are geographically closer than a large number of the other member councils.
Through you, President Member, you'll see that the waste industry is large, and we're talking about big tonnages, and working together with other councils of similar mind is an important approach to waste minimisation, etc. So we're not specifically working with the councils outside MRC at this particular time, but you'll see as the waste strategy develops and we identify opportunities and projects and the work we want to do, we'll be looking for like-minded partners to progress that. So it's definitely on the agenda, but there's nothing specific at this time.
Thank you, Director. Anything further? No? Okay, item 7.1, financial statements as at 31 January 2018. Councillor Hallett.
Sorry, a few for this one as well. Through to our new Director, in relation to revenue, are you able to comment on factors influencing that negative variance for the education and welfare, and then the significant positive variance for health, which as a category I assume it goes beyond just the increased food premise licences, so wondering what actually underpins that variance.
To the Director. Thank you.
Sorry, through the presiding member, I'm apologising. I'm having really bad trouble hearing tonight. I'm not sure if I've got blocked ears from the weekend. Would you mind repeating the last part of that question for me? Thank you.
Just regarding the variances for education and welfare, so there was a negative variance and what that entails, and then also the positive variance for health, which is quite substantial. What are the factors for that?
Through the presiding member, in relation to the health variances, we've received a number of applications, and we've been undertaking inspections during this period, the annual inspections during this period. So that's the reason for the variance. The issue is the timing of the budgeting wasn't carried out correctly to start with. We should have gone into more detail to make it clear when these inspections would be occurring, in what month. So that's the reason for that variance in relation to health. Education and wellbeing, I'll need to defer to the Director of Corporate Services.
Through the presiding member, I'll have to take that on notice. Thank you.
Councillor Hallett.
This might be for a different director, but in regard to dog registrations being lower than anticipated, is this a likely ongoing trend just because of increased higher density, or are we reaching saturation of current dog owners, or do we think there's another reason for that?
It's the Director of Community Engagement? Yeah. Thanks.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I will take that on notice. Anecdotally, I very much doubt that it is a decrease in dog ownership that's reflected in those figures, because that's certainly not what we see within our community, and also within the most recent dog registration period in October. So I will take that on notice and just try and get to the bottom of why that's the case.
To the Director of Community Engagement again, there was over $6,000 budgeted for the dog pound, with 70% of the building maintenance budget expended and none of the other expenses, which left $4,000 out of a $6,000 budget not spent. Do you know what the budget was kind of earmarked for, and the reasons for it not being expended?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, from memory there was some drainage issues, and I think it was associated with some works in that regard that once we looked at it in further detail, it was deemed not an appropriate fix to the issue. So again, I'll just double check that and confirm that in the briefing notes, but I'm certain that it's related to some drainage issues.
Anything further, Councillor Hallett?
Two more. Just wondering about the shortfall in expenditure for childcare and playgroup building maintenance.
Is that through to the Director of Engineering?
About 2,000, I think.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I'm sorry, I'll take that on notice. Get an answer by the end of the week.
One more, Councillor.
That's fine. And just under the capital works, there was 8,000 allocated, but no expenditure on the solar lighting of laneways. It's fine to be on notice as well.
Thank you, Director. I'll take that on notice. Anything further? I just had a question in relation to the Director of Engineering in relation to the local roads program. Throughout the financial statements, there was a reference to, I believe it was increase in scope. Let me have a look at my notes. Yeah, the local roads program that noted there was an increase in scope across a number of items, and this would be reviewed through the mid-year budget review process. I just wondered what the increase in scope in that program was.
Through you, Presiding Member, I'll take that question on notice as well, if that's okay.
Thank you. Nothing further on the financial statements. Okay, we will move on to item 7.2, the Local Government Act Review, City of Vincent responses to the Department of Local Government, Sports and Cultural Industries discussion paper. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you. Through the Chair to the CEO, just in regards to Section 1 in regards to Council and CEO relationship, I'm probably putting you on the spot, so feel free to take this on notice, but I'm interested in your view on what the advantages and disadvantages of extending the role of council in having the ability to directly employ an executive team rather than a CEO only.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, in essence that's already the case. Council members, certainly everyone around this table, has employed at least one of the executive team, sometimes more, in addition to myself. Under the Local Government Act, there is currently a somewhat ambiguous requirement. And I only say ambiguous because it could be more clearly defined. And I think that might be some of the point that the discussion paper is trying to emphasise, that the CEO cannot make a decision themselves to appoint or dismiss an employee who's classed as a senior employee, which in our instance means the directors. So if I want to make a decision or make a recommendation to council to appoint a director, and that is exactly the process I have to embark on, bring a report to council. So I will do all of the recruitment and then bring to council a recommendation. It is council's prerogative to accept or not accept the recommendation. If council rejects the recommendation, then under the Act it just needs to provide a reason why. It creates, as you can imagine, somewhat of an awkward situation, but it is the legal right of council nonetheless, and has occurred in local government in the metro area in the last 1 to 2 years of situations that I'm aware of. Having said all of that, the preference that I would have is for at most the status quo to remain, and I say at most because I think it's disadvantageous for the CEO to not have the ability to directly influence and make the recommendation to council relating to the members of the executive team. Ultimately, council holds me to account for the performance of the organisation, and I think for that reason it's important that I am involved in recommending to council who's on the team of the executive team, because I'm going to be relying on them very heavily to deliver results that council is looking for from me and from the organisation more broadly. So I think it is a collaborative relationship that needs to continue. I would not see it as being kind of advantageous for council or the organisation necessarily for council to direct appoint directors. If that were the case, then presumably the same power would apply in reverse, that council would then have the power to remove directors. That whole environment creates, I think, some scope for risk and conflict that council would need to review in more detail, that I'd be happy to give some consideration to and have the discussion on. But yeah, my preference would be at most that the status quo remains. Happy to discuss it more if there's any more questions.
Councillor Murphy.
I guess I'm also interested to know what your view is if you think that there's too much responsibility or onus on a CEO in terms of running the local government business.
CEO?
Oh, through you, Deputy Mayor, of course I'm going to say yes. Yes, it's way too much responsibility. Look, I think it just comes with the territory. It is what it is. Council is the board. The CEO runs the organisation and reports to the board. And I think there is always opportunities to kind of review and revise the roles and responsibilities and the accountabilities that council has versus what the CEO has. But generally speaking, I'm probably quite biased because it's very familiar to me and it's what I've always known. So, I don't know.
So I guess what I get from that is that, yes, you do think that there's too much responsibility and pressure on a CEO, but you don't think that spreading that out over an executive team would make any difference.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, so I was being a little bit facetious before in saying, yes, there's too much responsibility. The reality is that the way that the organisation operates, the CEO as an individual can't achieve more than a team, and it's all a matter of teamwork in how administration works with council, how administration works to give effect to projects and initiatives that need to be done. So whilst the Act holds the position of CEO ultimately accountable for the performance of the organisation, and some very significant duties fall on the position of CEO in terms of OC health and safety, compensation, insurance, making sure that there is a healthy work environment for all staff and council members, and a whole raft of other responsibilities. The simple fact is that they are then cascaded down throughout the organisation through internal controls and delegations of authority, authorisations of other staff and personnel to make certain decisions in accordance with policies and procedures. So I think it's quite appropriate where it currently sits.
Anything further, Councillor Murphy? Any other questions on this item? No, we'll move on to item 7.3, adoption of the Standing Orders Amendment Local Law. No questions? Okay, item 7.4, draft financial reserves policy. No? Okay. Item 7.5, amended purchasing policy. Councillor Loden.
Somewhat related to the side lifting tender question, under section 3 we talk about motor vehicles and that we will select the highest efficiency vehicles. So for future tenders, as an example, this would be sufficient to ensure that we are selecting the highest efficiency or considering a higher efficiency vehicle when those opportunities come up.
Director of Engineering.
Yeah, through your presiding member, the simple answer is yes.
Anything further, Councillor Loden? Any other questions on this item? Councillor Harley?
Yes, through you, Chair. My question is in relation to additional tender exemptions for disability enterprises and registered Aboriginal enterprises. Through you, Chair, am I able to find out through what mechanism will you be identifying registered Aboriginal enterprises?
I'm not sure which director this relates to. Is it corporate services or CEO? Do you have any advice to give on that?
Through you, presiding member, I'll need to take that on notice. Thank you.
Councillor Harley?
Yep, thank you.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, just we'll have to look at it in a little more detail, although I'm quite sure that the state government's CUA does reference pre-approved Aboriginal corporations and trading entities, and I would suspect that if we were to default to anything, it would be to that, but we can provide the specifics of that anyway.
Thank you, CEO. That was, I guess, the point of my question about whether Aboriginal Business Directory set up by state government is the mechanism or whether there's a specific local government mechanism. My question about whether there's a specific local government mechanism is if there isn't one, why isn't there, and whether this administration can be talking with Welga about the need to set that up, or to at least work towards something like that, which is kind of local government specific. So I'd be just interested to know what ideas there are from administration about where to purchase those services from Aboriginal organisations.
CEO.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes, good points. We're happy to take those on board, and we'll report them back through the briefing notes and if there's anything further in the report.
Any further questions on this item?
Sorry, through you, Chair.
Councillor Harley.
I beg your pardon, one more question, and that is in regards to something that's been raised a few times here, which is also about increasing of local content and about purchasing through local providers, still with best price, etc., but about preferring local providers, all things being equal. So I'm just wanting to ask, I'm happy to have that on notice, but about what our approach is in regards to supporting our local businesses.
Director Corporate Services, do you have any comment to make in relation to what provisions there may be within the policy to support buying local within from City of Vincent providers?
Thank you, Presiding Member. I would like to take that on notice as well, if that's okay. Thank you.
If there's nothing further, we'll move on to item 7.6, authorisation of expenditure for the period 6 January 2018 to 1 February 2018. Any questions on that item? No. Item 7.7, the investment report as at 31 January 2018. Nothing this month. Item 7.8, the mid-year review of the annual budget for 2017-18. Any questions on the mid-year review? Okay, we are rolling through, and we have nothing from community engagement this month. I know. So now we'll move on to the Chief Executive Officer's section of the agenda. 9.1, the Corporate Business Plan Progress Update. Do I have any questions? No? How about the 9.2, the Community Budget Submissions for 2018-2019? Do I have any questions? Councillor Loden.
Just wanted to ask what information we could potentially, or how we would go about including something to make sure that we bring this information back to our community and it's shared and reported back out to people how we're spending our funds as well.
CEO?
Sorry, through you, Deputy Mayor, could I just ask if Councillor Loden could say the question again?
So I guess this talks to the community budget submission process, but as we go through and we report our budget cycle back to our residents, I was wondering if we can ask our residents about how they would like that information to be shared and how it would be broken down.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, thanks for that. Council members might recall that through previous budget development processes, we've really only touched on the form and content of the information that we would present back to the community with rates notices to provide a budget overview or a snapshot of what Council has adopted and the programs and projects that are scheduled for the year ahead. We've given some partial consideration in the past to the types of graphs and charts that would be included, and some council members have also previously expressed a desire to make the information provided to the community more thorough or more comprehensive and also more readable, so that it is more engaging and interesting for members of our community to actually decipher and engage with. That being the case, there is an opportunity through this exercise, if Council feels comfortable, to also expand the community budget submissions to also include a question around what type of information would you like to see presented back to you once the budget is adopted. Because I think it would be opportune to do it through this process rather than the number of other processes that we currently have ongoing or are soon to embark on. For example, after adopted by Council, advertising of the draft strategic community plan. It could be done through that vehicle or alternatively through this. If at least it's done through this, then we can start giving it some thought when the community budget submissions close off and report that back to Council well in advance of the budget being at a final point of preparation, so that we can start giving consideration then to how it's going to be framed and delivered to the community once adopted by Council. So look, I would be happy to get feedback from Council members. I can include a comment to that effect in the report, so that if there is a desire to do it, Council members really just need to let me know, and I'd be happy to craft an amendment for your review next week.
Councillor Loden, anything further? Councillor Castle?
Yes, I do, you presiding member, have a question about previous community budget submissions that were either accepted but not yet delivered, or deferred or perhaps accepted for future budget periods. What type of communication are we having with those budget submitters, and do we come back to them at this point in the process to say there's no need for you to resubmit that idea because it's already on the agenda? Are we having an ongoing conversation with those people?
CEO?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, good questions, and the reason it was raised in the report is because we'll be going back to those submitters that fell into that category, and this was the community budget submissions table considered by Council in July last year. So we'll be going back to all of the submitters that had a proposal deferred for consideration or only partially endorsed in 17-18 with a view to further consideration in 18-19, to advise them that they will automatically be carried forward. Notably, there were some submissions that were raised last year that had been flagged for consideration in out years, like 1920 or 2021. We won't be having the same conversation with those because Council, in dealing with the submissions last year, had clearly identified the year in which that level of reconsideration of proposals was going to occur. So for anything that occurs in 18-19, we'll be going back to those submitters as part of this exercise.
Any further questions? Okay. We'll move on to the information bulletin, item 9.3. Any questions? Councillor Hallett.
Through the presiding member to Director of Community Engagement. Just in the register of reports, there's a reference to Manor Inc. and a meeting on the 20th of February regarding homelessness service provision. Just wondering if it's possible to have an update on the outcomes of that meeting.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes, that was a meeting convened by the member for Perth, who successfully brought together a number of key service delivery agencies, as well as the City of Perth and the City of Vincent, to have, I guess, a bit of a fresh look at how we are addressing homelessness. There are a number of key outcomes that came from that meeting, but I guess most importantly, the group is going to be reconvening in about a fortnight's time. So to try and keep up the enthusiasm and the commitment. A lot of the conversation was piggybacking on the City of Perth's recent change in philosophy to dealing and addressing homelessness, and that was encouraging to see, but also addresses a lot of the same issues clearly that the City of Vincent are facing. So a very, very positive start, and with the agencies around the table led by the member of Perth, I'm very confident that that group will get some traction and hopefully start to deliver upon some of the root causes of the homelessness issue, as opposed to skirting around the services and I guess lots of individual agencies and individual local governments trying to act independently rather than addressing the issues more holistically.
Anything further, Councillor Hallett?
And just to the CEO, I guess there's a number of items from 2015 and 16 where the city's still waiting for a response from state government departments. And then there's also some in 2013 where we're waiting for advice from the Department of Lands in regard to Crown land queries. Just wondering, how long do we wait, and what kind of follow-up mechanisms do we have in place for those?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Great questions. I'll speak to the relevant directors this week and we'll see what can be done to hurry those along.
Thank you, CEO. Any further questions? No? Okay. In that regard, I will close the meeting, the briefing session now at 7:42 p.m. Thank you for your attendance in the gallery or online.